This is definitely my list. As I'm looking at it, as I like step back for a second and I look at it, there are 3 Marvel vs. Capcom titles on this list and 2 Killer Instinct games. It's definitely my list. There's also MVCI and X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Like every Marvel vs. Capcom game conceivable is on this list. My top 20 is actually every single MVC game. It's a hugely biased list, as like, you know, your personal greatest of all time list should be. Wait, hold on a second. Top 10, and I'm not here to make anyone happy. There we go. That's what that's about. Let's go! There might be things on this list that feel redundant to most people or some people, but not to me. And to me, like, these games are what has created me into a human being. Number 10, chicken tenders. Boneless, specifically. Chicken tenders represent Killer Instinct 1994. Yeah, KI back on the SNES days, right? And even before that was a pretty big game. And I don't know, it's funny like what it was about KI that I like so much. I think it was the fact that it was like the perfect mixture of what Capcom was doing and what Midway was doing with Mortal Kombat, right? It was something right in between. So to me, Killer Instinct I actually liked its roster. Still to this day, I think its roster is actually kind of banging because it's general. It's like very generalized. Like you get these super hyper like tropey characters, right? Like Raver Chick, Robot, Bone Man, Werewolf, you know, stuff like that. Fire Dude, Ice Dude, with Dinosaur. Within that design element, some really cool characters, right? I don't know, I really dig some of the roster, and not to mention how they look. It's hard for me to give the impression of how good Killer Instinct 94 looked. The moment that solidified Killer Instinct for me was the first time I saw it in an arcade, and you have no idea what it is, and you essentially see that it's a fighting game, and the game is so loud, right? The game is so audacious. The combos are so insane. If there was ever a fighting game that existed in 1994 that, you know what, we're just gonna take what every single other one of these fighting games is doing, we're gonna jack it up to 11, right? We're actually going to break the dial and go higher than the 10. That was Killer Instinct, and you felt that. I feel like, especially getting into the eyes and the hearts of like young teenage boys, if not 10-year-olds and stuff like that. My God, dude, like everything about the presentation of KI was meant to get your attention, and it worked. It really worked. It worked for me so much that this was the actual first fighting game that I played competitively in 1995, in the summer of 95, funny enough. So the game had come out on like SNES, maybe the late summer. I grinded everything. Strategy Guide, the one that you got for free from Nintendo Power, was like my Bible, dude. I read that thing so many times. I played every single character in the game to the point where there would be weeklies at like a rec room where I grew up in the mountains, and everybody would play KI. It was probably way less people than I thought it was, but it felt like there was a solid like 20 to 30 people that would show up to play KI of a variety of ages between like 10 to 18. That experience of like always going back home, practicing some dank stuff to go back the next week to do this, to show it off. It was amazing. I largely can thank Killer Instinct. It was the first time I ever like got that competitive mindset without even realizing it was a competitive mindset. And I think we've definitely talked about this in the past with like the fighting games that made me, you know? KI is definitely absolutely a fighting game that made me, the old 1994 version. But that's number 10. Number 9, I gotta give to Smash Brothers Ultimate. And I almost consider Smash Brothers Ultimate not just to be this version of the game, I almost also consider it Smash for Wii U, because Smash for Wii U built directly into Ultimate. Its roster, its mechanics, like everything directly brought over. And I feel like we've been following and watching and playing Smash Ultimate / Smash for Wii U for so long. It's eclipsed Smash Melee. I go back and I play Melee now, And that for the longest time was like the epitome of the Smash experience, and just hoping that 4 was going to play that way. Dude, at that point, it's crazy to think of going back to Melee because I just hate the way that game feels now, right? It's such a funny thing. I really dislike the way Smash Melee feels whenever we go back to it because of the way Smash like Ultimate and the way modern day Smash play and feel. And that's a really important thing. Like the way these games are just feel friggin' amazing. Not to mention how many characters, how much content is a big deal, and how many earth-shattering dream come true moments Smash 4 Wii U as well as Smash Ultimate essentially did and brought to life. It's almost a guaranteed spot in here just based on the fact that Cloud, Strife, and Sephiroth are playable characters in a modern day fighting game that is fun, you know? That isn't like guys. Yeah, like for almost those reasons alone, like Smash Ultimate and its crazy fever dream roster stuff, important. It's the one fighting game that makes you realize how important characters are. There's always time for Smash. There always is. There's always room for Jello, and there's always time for Smash. If only the netcode was good. Mother fiver. My number 8 spot goes to Tekken 3. And this was another one of the games that was also in the greatest fighting games of all time. I feel like I'm just redundant if I explain the reasons. T3 was a big one to me personally, simply because like there was just so much to do in this game. Before 1998, there was so much stuff in Tekken 3 that you could do and play and unlock. Like I remember being obsessed with the music of this game. It took Virtua Fighter, right? A series of games that I absolutely loved, like VF2 and beyond was just so sick to me. So I love Virtua Fighter, but the problem is that Tekken 3 existed, and T3 essentially made Virtua Fighter 2 make its roster look stupid and cheesy. Tekken 3's cool, you know? Virtua Fighter eventually like grew and became more like over the years, and I feel like I might prefer VF in some ways in later versions. But my god, dude, it was like by the time Tekken 3 had come out, it just dominated the 3D fighting game space. It was so good. And not to mention every single person and your mother played it. So you always had somebody to play. You always had somebody that knew how to play Tekken 3, and that was important. It was also like one of the other earlier fighting games that I would go to like tournaments, very minor competitively, just as much as I could. When you don't have a car, it's kind of difficult. Like that's another one of those, right? I love Tekken 3 so much that I wanted to go, you know, compete. And there wasn't many Tekken 3 arcade machines that were easy to find because, you know, everyone had it on PlayStation. Mortal Kombat X is my number 7. And I feel like if anybody has been around since 2015, realize the reasoning behind this. It makes a lot of sense. Mortal Kombat X was essentially just trying to be UMK3. Mortal Kombat 9 was kind of like a modernization of Mortal Kombat 2 in many ways. So to me, like the gameplay stuff that they were setting up in MKX was already just so interesting, you know? They're trying to get these characters to move their asses off, to run cancel, to do all this nutty stuff. Just inherently, the game is so aggressive. And then you get like the DLC, right? And then you get the actual additions to the game itself, and arguably some of like the best DLC in fighting games, I'd say. And already you had some of these characters doing some of the most fun things you've ever seen Mortal Kombat characters do before. Like I actively looked forward to learning new members of the roster just because their combos were so much fun. Figuring out how to open up people with shit is just so much fun. Did it feel cheap and unfair? Yes. But it also felt amazing to do this to somebody else. It's like the epitome of one of those games where it's like you're essentially exposing your brutal offense to somebody. You know, you have to deal with it, but now it's your turn. Yeah, MKX is such an aggressive game that it's still fun to watch for me. It's that push and pull that makes it really interesting. While a lot of fighting games are momentum-based, this one really is momentum-based in like the purest sense of the word. And I just love MKX, man. There's too much of this game for me to talk highly about that I feel like I'm just going to repeat these things over and over again. MKX is my personal favorite Mortal Kombat game of all of them. It isn't just one of my favorite fighting games of the decade. There is always a place in my heart to play MKX. My number 6 spot goes to what is largely considered to be the greatest fighting game of all time by a very large margin of people. You hear this from essentially a very large casual audience that this is just the greatest fighting game of all time. My team is Thanos, Spider-Man, and Dan. And I'm godlike. It's Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Weirdly enough, is one of those games that even as time has gone on, has actually like shown its mettle, right? It isn't a game where the initial impression is that, oh, this is just MSP the game. You're gonna pick Cable, you're gonna pick Captain Commando, you're gonna, you know, scrum it out with Santhrax, like, oh god, like all these tried and true teams that we essentially thought is how you played Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Probably wouldn't have put it very highly, you know, back in the day, but I feel like over time, especially when you start to play like mid-tier to low-tier Marvel 2, damn is it fun. Oh my god, the game becomes so much more interesting when you introduce ratio. And I think that's such a valuable aspect to MVC2 in general. Once you start actually playing these other characters that aren't, you know, literally god tier and realizing what they can do and actually utilizing the core system mechanics and how they work together, and you come up with some really creative and crazy shit, holy hell, it is a blast. I'm not a big fan of high tier MVC2, but I feel of like all the games on this list, that mid-tier Marvel 2, mid-tier of like all these games, MVC2 is one of the greatest games of all time. It is absolutely wonderful to have like some weird-ass team combination and then you actually make it work. Yeah, I really like MVC2. I think it's hard to not like MVC2. It unfortunately doesn't play as good as some of the other Marvel vs. Capcom titles. It still feels fantastic. You got to get used to it, but it feels fantastic once it clicks. And you have to give it like a day or two. It's one of those kind of games where you have to get used to how these old games play. Yeah, I love MVC2. I think it's impossible for most people to not like Marvel vs. Capcom 2. There's a reason why I wanted to make a pitch to bring the game back, because I think it deserves it. I think it's complete horseshit that we can't go out and buy and find a way to support MVC2 in some way. I still think it's horseshit. Here's one that would be surprising to many. Didn't end up making the top 10 in the previous list. Is absolutely a very profound game for me, and it's Soul Calibur 1. And I just went over my reasoning. The reason Soul Calibur 1 is such a big deal to me personally is because Soul Calibur 1 represented a turning point in the entire existence I had known video games. Up until Soul Calibur 1 in 1999, the whole reason arcades existed was because the arcade experience was the best experience. Some people have reasons to love the arcade more than others, but to me, going to the arcade was important because you were essentially playing the best version of that game. Those versions of arcade games in the arcade were not duplicated anywhere else. That shit is a big reason why Soul Calibur essentially takes a spot in my top 10. Soul Calibur 1 gets my number 5th spot. And the reason is because I had a game that was better than the arcade at home. Weirdly enough, on very affordable hardware. $200 for a Dreamcast was always a steal back in the day. I feel like Soul Calibur had such a profound effect on my entire perception of what arcade games and fighting games kind of are. It was just such a big deal. I did everything in this game. I unlocked absolutely every single piece of unlockable artwork and all the extra stuff that you could do. Like, I did everything, man. The craziest part is that it still plays great and it still looks good. An absolute impossible game. The fact that it looks so much better than the arcades and the fact that it played better than almost any 3D game out there at the time. The reason I put it above Tekken 3, because Tekken 3 does play amazing. I love the mobility of Soul Calibur, how much freedom of movement you had. And for the longest time, with Virtua Fighter included, you did not get that freedom of movement. Soul Calibur gave you the ability to make your characters zip around. And it got even crazier in Soul Calibur 2. And while I like the gameplay and a lot of things more in Soul Calibur 2, that experience of Soul Calibur 1 is a big deal. Is a big deal. Profound impact on my life, man. This game was great. Just absolutely wonderful. Next should be no surprise. And the game just keeps delivering. This game just somehow finds a way through fan interpretation, tournaments, through everything. This game just finds a way to keep delivering, which is hilarious. It's Ultimate Marvel 3. Not to mention that Marvel 3 was essentially the fighting game that got me to really commit myself to making content in 2011. Even when I was working full-time. Once again, the rebirth of something that was lost for a long time. When MVC2 was still being played up until Marvel 3 came out, people kept saying, like, you know, like, we had to wait a decade for this game, and it was true. Like, you had to wait like 10 more years until we get a new Marvel vs. Capcom, right? UMVC 3 is special because it is so much better than Marvel 3 Vanilla. And I had a lot of issues with Marvel 3 Vanilla. We're lucky that the one expansion this game got fixed so many more of those problems. And it's still such a fun game to this day. And there's so many things about this game that I hate. There was a few years in between where I actually really hated Ultimate Marvel 3, where I really disliked this game. And I think it's because it became like my job to have to make content around it. And those were the years where it was like some of the mechanics were really grinding on me and I was having to play it online. I feel like when I eventually let go of my competitive spirit for UMVC 3, that's when I learned to really love it. Those were the moments when I didn't have to specifically deal with these insanely challenging moments that the highest level of competition would have to. That's when I realized how much I actually liked UMVC 3 when I was not taking it seriously. There was a middle point where there's like a growing period, you know, where there was like, I had my divorce with this game around like the mid 2010s. I'd say especially after like 2020, when the pandemic hit and people figured out Parsec and all that stuff, man, I just grew to love it all over again. Of all the games on this list, hilariously, there's only one current game in quote-unquote active development still, and that is UMVC 3. UMVC 3 is still getting stuff added to it to this day from fans, which is hilarious and amazing. Oh man, this was a tough one. So we're into my top 3 now, and all 3 of these games are, I'd say a couple of them are obvious, but this one might not be as much, and I've talked about it a few times in the past because I've obviously played the hell out of this game on YouTube and Twitch. It's Marvel vs. Capcom 1. Not to be super redundant, because we have recently did a like about a year ago, we did the fighting games that made me. MVC 1 was in there for sure. A lot of the games in my top 10 are like the fighting games that made me, you know? MVC 1 was the reason I even learned how to use an arcade stick. Still, in my opinion, one of the best looking, best presentation of any fighting game out there. I'd argue I like MVC 1's presentation even more than games like Third Strike. In fact, I would argue MVC 1 has the best presentation of any 2D Capcom fighting game. That might be a hot take to some. Some might prefer Darkstalkers, some might prefer the 3D backgrounds of CVS 2 and Marvel 2. And I understand, but to me, it is essentially the epitome of some of the best choice of characters you can stick into what is essentially a small roster fighting game. Not to mention all of the assist characters that are in the game too. There was so much in MVC 1 that made me passionate about it when it came out that I just dedicated my life to this game for like 6 months. And if not beyond, there wasn't like a day I didn't not think about playing Marvel vs. Capcom 1, the arcade version, right? You have to understand, this is specifically an arcade experience. We didn't have MVC 1. There was no home port for years. This game came out in like 1998, right? We would have to wait for an eventual Dreamcast port to show up maybe a year and a half later or something like that. So this is specifically like the arcade experience of Marvel vs. Capcom 1. Is the game dominated by top tiers? Is it horribly unbalanced? Is it, you know, got some cheap ass characters that I absolutely hate? Gold War Machine and Hyper Venom? Yes, I hate those characters. Red Venom, I hate them. But it doesn't change the fact that Gambit and Strider and Mega Man and Ryu turning into every single Shoto, there are so many like awesome aspects of MVC 1's roster and its visual elements that I just love. I just love. It holds a special place in my heart, which is why it's so high. I feel like MVC 2 and Marvel 1 would obviously be way higher. They obviously would. But between my personal experiences, how much it had an impact on me, how much I played it competitively, how much I dedicated my life to this game, and now going back and retrospectively looking at MVC 1, why did I do all that stuff? And then you look at the roster, you hear the music, you look at the stages, you look at the colors of the game, and it makes sense. Yeah. The game is gorgeous. Might be the best overall encompassing 2D Capcom fighting game ever, in my opinion. And yeah, we're down to number 1 and number 2. And it should be obvious at this point. Number 2 is Killer Instinct 2013 to 2017. Every season in between. Not only like its existence, realizing its existence, playing it, realizing how good it plays, making the old KIs like feel like dangerously outdated, which could be considered 3 different games, but we'll just consider it one game. What do we even need to say at this point? Like, the craziest part is that over the years, it has grown in notoriety and overall popularity. This is one of those fighting games that like weirdly has seeped into its way of almost every single top 10 fighting game list in some way. Like, it's a weird game where it's like cultural influence over the years. And we just ran into this again. Killer Instinct's the reason that Smash Melee got slippy like rollback netcode. Killer Instinct's like weird influence on how its season model would work, how it would release characters seasonally, is essentially how every single fucking fighting game does it now. Not to mention being one of the first larger released fighting games that actually did use rollback netcode. Like, there are so many things that Killer Instinct does right. It's nuts. It's just crazy. It's an impossible game. Should never have been as good as it was, been as lucky as it was to get so many talented developers throughout multiple different studios to turn it into something just fucking huge. And I'm not even mentioning the music or the sound design or the redesigns of characters that were amazing, or the stage ultimates and eventually the musical ultras. Like, there's a problem with KI 2013 modern KI. There's a problem with it. There's one big issue, and that issue is that you can't strike lightning twice. So if you want to get lightning in a bottle again, it's almost going to be impossible, especially for how low budget the game was made. And that is like one of the biggest issues that I think Killer Instinct faces if it's going to become something else in the future. Microsoft really got the bang for their buck. This game almost has as much of an uphill battle as like the next Smash Brothers. It's almost impossible for the next game to like meet the expectations of fans, you know? It's almost impossible. Yeah, my number 2 greatest fighting game of all time is actually Killer Instinct 2013. I think modern KI deserves every single accolade it gets, and it seems that as time goes on, people have now realized how good it is. And more people realize how good it is because the game is easy to play, relatively cheap, if not free. So the more people play it, the more people realize, damn, this game is really good. Damn, this game does solve most problems that most fighting games have. Damn, this game does have a really interesting, crazy roster of characters. And what's the number 1 fighting game of all time? In my opinion, the greatest fighting game of all time. If you want to talk about like the actual feel of fighting an opponent, the actual feel of combat, the epitome of 2D combat, the greatest it's ever been done is Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. Of course it is. Another game that just over time, so many people proclaim to be like the greatest fighting game. You get some really weird takes where it's like, no, Street Fighter 3 Third Strike is the greatest fighting game because it is the most balanced. And immediately you know that person has no idea what they're talking about. However, they really like Third Strike, even though since they're saying that, they're really bad at it. But that's the weird thing, is that even though you get people that like this super hardcore fighting game that they're obviously really bad at because they think Third Strike is balanced, they think they're good at it, but that's important, right? Because all this game is just an arcade game. It's just an arcade game. There's no bells and whistles. There's no story mode. There's no combo trials, except like the HD versions later. There's no like all this extra shit you can do in Third Strike. People talk about the impressions of Third Strike just from its raw, visceral combat, sound effects, and visuals. Just the most intrinsic and important things that make a fighting game a fighting game. How good does it feel? How good does it play? How fun is it? All these things are like the most critical and important things. How much of a spectacle is the game, right? Third Strike has everything while still feeling pure. There's a weird thing about Street Fighter 3 Third Strike that I admire, and it's its purity, because there is nothing really in the game that is super fantastical and crazy. Third Strike is not a graphical powerhouse along the lines of Tekken 3 was when it first came out. Third Strike is not a game that has the most bombastic combos like the chicken tendies that go to 1 billion hits and everything is ultra screaming. Third Strike doesn't have the character roster that a game like Smash Ultimate does, which essentially became video games the game. Third Strike is not also a crazy offensive game full of nutty characters and guest characters. It's not that. It's also not a team game. It also isn't a hyperactive sort of like 3D game, huge spectacle, just like Ultimate Marvel 3 and Marvel vs. Capcom, and also doesn't feature like a shit ton of characters like Killer Instinct that do all these crazy fucking things. There is something weirdly simplistic that Third Strike has that is the same as every one of the games on this list, but is also not audacious. It doesn't like take everything to 11. It doesn't try to do that. All it does is execute every single one of its mechanics, every single one of its gameplay concepts in a way that is like perfect. And the only reason that happened, and we've investigated it over a few videos, talking with the devs and stuff like that, is because they had two games that essentially failed, that set them up to make Third Strike as good of a game as it is. Where most 2D fighting games still model themselves after 3S, weirdly enough. Third Strike's not the most balanced fighting game at all, but there's still something about playing any character in Third Strike that is genuinely special compared to every fighting game on this list. And there's something about the mechanics in Third Strike that just make each individual moment like exciting. There's so much decision making that happens in every critical moment that I just love it, dude. Like there's always a reason to play it. The game's insanely optimized to this day. But if you get a room of people that really love 3S and they're just playing their heart out of it, you start to see why it's so good. It's like these things that stick to your bones that you just can't get rid of. Once you like dip your toes in and you fall in love, you're never gonna forget it. That's why Third Strike is amazing. 24 years later, the greatest fighting game ever made. And I can say it without a shadow of a doubt, even though I might play some more games on this list a bit more frequently because of the modern age, and this old 2D game is just, you know, it's an old 2D game. Why are you playing this old game? Because it's the best. Yeah, I'm confident with this. This feels good. All of this shit feels right. And I feel like this order is good. My personal top 10 was KI 94 at number 10, Smash Ultimate at number 9, Tekken 3 at number 8, Mortal Kombat X at number 7, MVC 2, number 6, Soul Calibur 1, number 5, Ultimate Marvel 3, number 4, Marvel 1, number 3, KI, Modern KI, number 2, Third Strike, number 1.